So we're going to attempt to do that today with the concept diagram, so that students can understand what it is, what it is not. I just gotta wait here for my computer to load. Here we go. So first off, we're going to start here with the overall concept, which is poetry. So we'll put that in there as soon as my computer cooperates. And that's step number 1, to identify the concept. And then step number 2, we're going to identify the overall concept, or the larger concept. So we've got poetry. And we'll make it in somewhere there. And then next we have the larger one, which is the larger concept that poetry is within is literature form, the form of literature. And so once we've got our overall concept, we're going to move on to number 3 here, which is keywords. So some keywords: meter, rhyme, rhythm, metrical patterns. We'll do some authors: Edgar Allan Poe in this unit. Edgar Allan Poe. Alliteration is a big one, along with other figurative devices. We've got lines, stanzas, quatrains, and then we have types of poetry. So we have ballad, elegy, and so on. We've got a little smaller to fit in there. Okay. So next we have the characteristics of poetry. So one thing that is going to distinguish poetry from other forms of literature are the lines. Poetry is unique because it is written in lines. You're going to see paragraphs in other forms of literature. We've got verses. In poetry, we have an awareness of experience. And if I were doing this with a class right now, I would have already gone through all of this, and I would be asking for suggestions from the students. And it's through these suggestions that I can understand their prior knowledge of this unit. We're going to see sound and rhythm in some form in poetry, and we're also going to have some aesthetic qualities, so focusing on the sensory experiences, and of course figurative devices we're always going to have in some form or another in poetry. Put that in there. Alright, so now moving on to the sometimes present. So sometimes we're going to have musical effects. You can see this in some of Langston Hughes' poetry, for example, or Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to see rhyme sometimes, alliteration sometimes, not always, frequently though. We can see full sentences. Some poets use full sentences in their poetry. I think people tend to think that that's not the case. We'll sometimes see symbolism. Types of poetry we'll see epic poem. Sometimes we can see dialogue. We can see punctuation. So those are just a few things that we're going to see in poetry. Some things that are never present in poetry. prose, and prose is what poetry is not, so that one's a little obvious. We're not going to see any technical writing. I thought about putting biography or autobiography, but I think that poems can really be biographical or autobiographical, and so I think when you kind of go into some of those, it really does get tricky. We're not going to see a novel. We can see epic poems, which may be published in what people might consider a novel form, but it's not a novel. We're not going to see paragraphs. At least I've never seen paragraph in poetry. And it's actually pretty difficult to pinpoint some of the things that you're not going to see because so much can happen in poetry. So what's never present is pretty much what poetry isn't, such as technical writing or prose. Okay, so moving on, we've got our characteristics of poetry. Now let's move on to some examples. So first one is Where the Sidewalk Ends. A lot of students will be familiar with this poem. It's a children's poem written by Shel Silverstein. And it was personally one of my favorite poems. It has a lot of musical qualities to it, a little bit sing-songy, and students will automatically recognize this poem. So a non-example that's similar, we'll say a children's story such as Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That is not a poem. Okay, so another example, let's do The Raven. A lot of students will be familiar with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Very famous poem. So we can do another of Edgar Allan Poe's as a non-example, A Telltale Heart. And this one is clearly written in story form with paragraphs. There might be some literary devices and a lot of emotion and animation in this story, but it's not written in lines. It's not a poem. Okay, so the next one is The Red Wheelbarrow, short poem realism is featured there. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. It's a short little poem. And because that's a poem with realism, we'll use another form of American realism, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which most students will know is a novel. It's not poetry. And then lastly, we'll do Paradise Lost, which many students might not be familiar with. The epic poem by John Milton. That many students might read their senior year, junior year of high school, or in college. And to pair with that, we'll do The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. Hunchback of Notre Dame is clearly not a poem. Many students will be familiar with it. And then lastly, we will have our definition. Number 7, let's practice with a new example. I almost forgot about that. So let's do, let's see, Harry Potter. This one's a little obvious. But just as an example, we'll go through, is it written in lines? No, then it's probably not a poem. We know that from the start. Verses, no. There's an awareness and an experience, not really any sound or rhythm or aesthetic qualities, although there are figurative devices. So we've got some of these, but not all of them. Sometimes present, rhyme, alliterations. We've got full sentences, some symbolism. We've got dialogue and punctuation. So we've got some of these. And one thing why we know it's not poetry right away, it's because it's written in prose and it's a novel. And poetry cannot be any of that. So that's a good one. Let's see. let's do one of Shakespeare's monologues. So let's say Juliet, or when Juliet says, "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Let's go through that, because this one would be a little bit trickier. Is it poetry? We know it's written in a play, so we'll see. Does it have lines? Yes. Verses? Yes. An awareness of an experience? Seems to be so. Juliet is decrying her name and why Romeo is part of the plan and why they are forbidden. Sound and rhythm, definitely. We've got aesthetic qualities in this monologue as well. And we've got figurative devices, so we've hit all these for poetry. We've got rhyme, alliteration, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo. We've got full sentences, and dialogue and punctuation. Over here, it's not prose, it's not a novel, and it's not written in paragraphs, and it's not technical writing. So for poetry, as of now, we would say that this monologue in Romeo and Juliet is poetry. Alright, so to tie down a definition, we're going to say that poetry, we're going to use our concept and then the overall concept. So poetry is a form of literature, and one of the key aspects of it is that it's written in lines. So we'll say that, and we'll say that it encompasses an awareness of experiences through sound and rhythm, aesthetic, sensory qualities, and figurative devices. And so there we go. Here is our concept diagram. Students will hopefully have a better understanding of what poetry is and what poetry is not by the time that they're done with this concept diagram. And so if I was doing this unit with students and we moved on, they would know from the start what poetry is